Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and welcome back to our incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last episode, we made a few preparations for our upcoming project, that project being yet another village. Now some of you might remember that we were actually hoping to get that built in our last episode, but in a rather unsurprising turn of events, I had, once again, severely underestimated the amount of stuff that needed to get done and severely overestimated my level of productivity, resulting in us having to build the village in this episode instead. However, putting my rather worrying and borderline crippling level of incompetence aside, we actually ended our last episode right as I was about to build a super smelter. As I deployed the strategy, I used the most out of my entire arsenal, that being to procrastinate and leave it for future Herkeph to deal with. So that is the first thing that we'll be tackling, though I was rather quickly reminded of yet another reason I decided to procrastinate, which was that we were going to build it under our villager trading hall, and in order to do that, we had to build an entire new floor on which we would build the previously mentioned smelter. But at this point, you might be thinking to yourself that I am a strong proponent of criminal activities involving a healthy amount of violence, and this is rather hard to incorporate in a super smelter, as we can, unfortunately, not cook stuff by punching them, even though it has been done in real life, which is actually pretty impressive. But to keep this at least somewhat on brand, we were going to use coal as fuel for the smelter, as that would hopefully emit an unlawful amount of pollution. It's not violent, but this is a compromise we would unfortunately have to oblige to. So I went on ahead and started work on the floor underneath our villager trading hall, which would come to house our previously mentioned pollution-focused project. I was actually about to say that we have a time-lapse for this, but that's apparently not the case. So here's an incredibly captivating and epic first-person montage. And after having spent enough time to acquire a bachelor's degree in medieval geography, we had finally replicated the center room from where we would branch out from to, in turn, proceed with our future, hopefully more violent activities. With that, we could finally get on to dealing with the super smelter, but since my memory is comparable to that of an average nursing home resident with dementia, I had to pop back into our creative testing world to double check just how much space was required. After that, I got started building the smelter, excited that I would soon not have to deal with it anymore. And after having spent a surprisingly short time, the smelter was finally complete. However, this is where I did something that I find rather surprising and really out of character of who I am as an individual. I decided to make the path to the smelter, as well as the input and output of the smelter presentable. I have absolutely no idea what came over me, but knowing myself and my tendencies, this was probably the best thing that could have happened, as all of the farms in our smaller towers have been neglected to the same degree as I have been by my mother, and after having spent even more time on this god-forsaken project, we were finally completely finished with the super smelter, meaning that we could now move on with our lives, which I did by getting to the reason why we needed the super smelter in the first place, that being to build some slight elevations on our replica of a mushroom island for absolutely no reason. But this time, I actually remembered to use the replay mod, so here's a time lapse. I decided to go with two little mounds, which would hopefully make the village a tiny bit more interesting. However, looking at it from above, it's quite apparent that the mounds are really small and will probably have a minimal impact on the overall build, meaning that I had spent several hours of my time that many say are the peak years of my life building an absolutely ridiculous super smelter for two incredibly underwhelming mounds. And just to top it all off, I had, as per usual, also completely forgotten to light the inside of the mounds up, meaning that I had to carry out a quick extermination mission. Whilst I was at it, I also lit up the inside of the platform itself so that we wouldn't have to deal with a bunch of noises from our basement, as I get enough of that in real life. But as I emerged once more, in a very elegant and fabulous manner, I came to the realization that the entire platform had turned into a mob farm, meaning that it would be rather difficult to work on the village during nighttime. But once I had slept, I made my way back down to the platform once more and started marking out where all of the houses would go. Just like I did for the Halloween village, and just like the Halloween village, we'll be color coding all of the houses to make a gradient-like transition of colors, in which I was intending to go from cyan into purple and finally into red. Once all of the positions for the houses had been picked out and assigned a color, I realized that I barely had any spruce wood, meaning that it was time for yet another resource gathering session. But with all of that schmexy wood collected, we could commence with the construction of our newest society that we would come to oppress in the future. And in order to get a somewhat semi-clear vision of what I would be doing, I had taken the liberty of building a few houses in a creative testing world. Some of you who've watched my other content might find that rather surprising, as I have a tendency to make things significantly harder, more convoluted, and tortuous than they need to be. But with that rather surprising turn of events, I got started building the houses. Though, as my memory is, as previously mentioned, comparable to that of an average resident of a nursing home suffering from dementia, I had somehow completely forgotten how to build the houses, meaning that I had to pop back into my creative world where I had designed them. And with that casual little display of one of the many reasons I have no friends, I started work on the small houses for the village. But after having built all of the small houses, I realized that I had severely underestimated how much materials I would need, as per usual. So I was left with 2 stacks and 1 piece of mushroom stem. This was a rather calamitous realization, as that meant that the small ones took over 6 stacks. And as some of you might be able to imagine, the small ones required the least amount of the previously mentioned stem. Those of you who have built anything using mushroom stems in the past would probably know that is the most annoying mushroom block to get. This meant that I had to spend a rather soul-crushing amount of time dealing with a bunch of mushrooms. Once that incredibly fun and rewarding task had been dealt with, I could go back and deal with the task at hand and build the medium-sized houses, which unlike the small ones, actually look like mushrooms. So here's another time lapse. And after having spent a bunch of time doing various tasks such as building, several additional trips back and forth to grab more materials, as well as what I would say is a healthy amount of procrastination, which is quite possibly something that my therapist might disagree with. But putting my therapist's lack of hope in my recovery aside, we were now ready to start working on the largest buildings of this project, which were literally just large and hollow mushrooms, which is where I intended to have my future oppression victims with fungal allergies to live. However, even though I had flown back and forth collecting materials throughout our last building session, I had still managed to run out of mushroom stems yet again, meaning that I got the opportunity to go back to the immaculately fabulous and entertaining gameplay of gathering a bunch of mushroom blocks. And whilst we were out gathering stuff, I thought that it probably wouldn't hurt grabbing some extra shroom lights, seeing as we were going to use some for one of the Giga mushrooms. We were then on the home stretch, where the 2 Giga mushrooms were the last buildings left for this project. However, I expected these to be the most annoying to build, as they were significantly more organic-like than the other builds. But at this point, I had already spent more time procrastinating than I would be comfortable admitting to my therapist. So I grabbed some more mushroom stems and started building yet again to finish this project once and for all. With that, we were pretty much completely done with the project as we only had some details left to add. One thing included in said details was a path to connect all of the houses, and the material I decided to use for them was a combination of packed mud, mud bricks, and coarse dirt, as I thought that made more sense than a stone path like we did in our last village. But now you might be wondering why I thought it made more sense to use mud rather than stone. So with the paths done, I moved on to adding chains to the underside of the mushroom caps from which we could hang lanterns and end rods, as I thought that would look cool, but it then hit me that we didn't actually have a design for lampposts to add to the village. This was a bit of a problem, as we didn't want any hostile mobs to spawn, as that would mean that the inhabitants of this village would have a way of escaping my fascistic escapades. So I jumped back into the creative testing world once more and tried to come up with a decent design for lampposts. I initially tried to make them look like mushrooms by using sandstone walls, birch, and red mushroom blocks. However, that looked about as pleasant as an infected hemorrhoid, so I decided to go for another strategy. I then remembered that I could do exactly what we did with our cave transformation, where we simply placed a red mushroom block on top of an end rod. This was actually perfect, as we could also use this to light up the rest of the platform. So I deployed our newly thought out master plan and spammed a bunch of end rods to then place a red mushroom block on top. I then grew a bunch of mushrooms surrounding the village, as the platform was looking almost as lonely and empty as me. But as I had grown the previously mentioned mushrooms, I remembered that mobs can spawn on top of them unless they're lit up. The red ones were pretty simple and straightforward to deal with, as we could just stick a light source on top and hide it with a red carpet. However, the brown ones were a bit more tricky, so I started exploring my options in our heavily overused creative testing world, in which I made the rather unexpected discovery that the color of brown mushrooms is really similar to that of junglewood. So I decided to use junglewood trapdoors on top of the brown ones, and with that, we were completely finished with our second village. But that is about all the time we have for this episode. So there we have it, the 23rd episode of our incredibly stupid hardcore world. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next one.